They said the answer was buried in the rocks, and for most of my life I believed they were right. Only I had the meaning upside down. I thought the rocks were the curse. It took me 58 years and a notebook older than my own father to understand they were the cure. My name is Silas Carver, and the land I farm sits along the Slate belt of eastern Pennsylvania, a long gray spine of earth that runs under the hills of Northampton County, like the back of some sleeping animal that never wanted us there. 174 acres, 4 generations of men who broke their backs against ground that broke their hearts. First, and 3 of them lie now in the churchyard at the bottom of the hill, under stones cut from the same slate that beat them. The soil on the Carver place was not soil the way other men knew it. It was dense and pale and shot through with flat blades of slate that surfaced every spring like the land was spitting out everything we tried to feed it. You could plow a field clean in April and walk it again in May and find new stones standing in the furrows, stones that had not been there, stones that came up out of the deep as if the earth itself were rejecting the work of human hands. My father used to say the field grew rocks better than it grew anything else, and he said it as a joke for the first 30 years of his life and as something closer to a prayer of surrender for the last 10. I think of my father often now. Wade Carver was a big man with careful hands, and he loved this ground the way a man loves a wife who will not love him back, which is to say completely and without any hope of return. He had tried everything in his time. He bought the fertilizers the county told him to buy, and he took the loans the bank told him to take, and he watched his corn come up thin and yellow, year after year, while the men down in the bottoms grew theirs tall and green on better dirt. I was a boy at his elbow through most of it. I remember the year he mortgaged the back 40 to buy a new planter, certain that the trouble was in the machine and not in the ground, and I remember the look on his face that October when the yield came in no better than the year before. He did not curse. He did not weep. He stood at the edge of the field with his hat in his hand, and he looked at the dirt for a long time. And then he put his hat back on and went into supper and never said a word about it. And something in him had gone quiet that never came back loud again. He died believing the land had beaten him. He died believing he had failed his own father and would pass that failure down to me like a deed. That belief is the inheritance I've carried longest, heavier than any note the bank ever held. So you will understand that when I stood at the edge of the north field that cold morning with the frost still in the ground, I was not a young man chasing a wild idea. I was an old man trying to lay a ghost to rest. I kicked at one of those stones with the toe of my boot, and it turned up out of the dirt, a jagged gray plate smooth on one side and sharp on the other. I bent down and picked it up and turned it over in my hand, and I felt something I had no right to feel. A kind of promise. A foolish, stubborn promise that I could not have explained to a single living soul without sounding like a man who had finally lost the thread that held him to his senses. Every other farmer in that valley saw rocks as the enemy. They cleared them and piled them into walls and buried them in trenches deep enough to forget. My father had spent whole autumns hauling them off in a stone boat behind the tractor, cursing each one as a thief that had stolen another inch of plantable ground. But I had spent that whole winter doing a thing no carver before me had thought to do. I had been reading geology papers, agricultural chemistry, soil science journals. I ordered through the county library, carried home in a paper sack, and read at the kitchen table night after night until my eyes burned and the coffee went cold in the cup, and Maggie came and put a blanket over my shoulders without a word and went back up to bed. And somewhere, in all those pages in language written by men who had never set foot in Northampton County, I'd come to a conclusion that the whole valley would have called insane. The soil was not dead. It was suffocating. It was rich beyond measure, richer than the black bottoms the cooperative farmed, only every ounce of that richness was locked inside the very stones that 4 generations of carvers had spent their lives trying to throw away. The calcium was in the slate. The magnesium was in the slate. The potassium and the phosphorus and a dozen trace minerals that corn starves for, all of it sealed inside flat gray plates of rock that we had been hauling off the field as fast as the field could grow them. We had been throwing away the harvest for 100 years because it did not look like a harvest. It looked like stones. The mockery started the way these things always do on a Tuesday. The Cedar Bluff Feed and Supply sat at the crossroads where the county road met the old turnpike. And on a Tuesday morning, every farmer within 20 miles passed through it for seed or salt or just for the company of other men who understood the particular loneliness of working dirt. I had driven in for welding rod and a second-hand cutting torch, and I was loading the torch and its tanks into the bed of my truck, the steel heavy and cold in my arms, when Sterling Mercer crossed the gravel lot toward me with his hands in the pockets of a wool coat that cost more than my pickup was worth on its best day. Mercer ran the Cedar Bluff Cooperative, and running it meant he ran most of the valley with it. He set the prices the farms paid for fertilizer and the prices the farms got for their grain at harvest, and he sat on the board that decided which operations got the good contracts and which ones got the cold shoulder. He was perhaps 44 years old, smooth in the face with polished boots that had never broken sod, and a smile that always arrived a half-second before he meant it. The way a thing arrives that has been rehearsed in a mirror. "Still trying to farm a quarry, Silas," he said, and he pitched it loud enough for the 3 men standing by the coffee machine inside the open door to turn and listen. I tightened the strap over the torch tanks and said nothing. "I hear you went and bought yourself an industrial rock crusher," he went on, warming to it. "You planning to pave the place over or just give up on corn altogether and sell gravel to the township by the ton?" The laughter came easy then from the men at the door, easy and warm, and aimed at me like the heat off a stove. I have lived a long time in a valley where men laugh at what they do not understand, and I had learned long before that morning not to give the laughter anything to feed on. I straightened up slow and looked at Mercer, and I let the silence sit between us for a breath longer than was comfortable, because silence is a thing most men cannot abide. And the few who can hold it are dangerous in ways the loud ones never learn until it is too late. "The soil out there has everything it needs," I said. "It is just too stubborn to give it up on its own. So I mean to force the issue." Mercer stepped closer, and the rehearsed smile went somewhere I could not follow it. "You're going to force a bankruptcy," he said, and he said it quietly now. Just for me, and the quiet was a great deal worse than the laughter had been. "That land of yours is worth more as a tax write-off than it will ever be worth as a farm, and you know it, and I know it, and the bank knows it best of all. My board has authorized me to make you an offer. Half of what your family has put into that ground over the years. You take that today, Silas, before the bank comes knocking, because we both of us know that it is coming." It was a low thing to say, and he said it gently, which made it lower still. He knew about the note. Of course he knew. In a valley that size, a man like Mercer made it his whole business to know exactly how close every one of his neighbors stood to the edge of the cliff, and he knew that the Carver place carried $94,000 of debt hanging over it like a blade on a fraying rope, and he knew the rope was going. "It is not for sale," I said. "It will be," he answered, and he turned back toward his men with the smile climbing again onto his face. "By harvest," he said over his shoulder, "it will be cheap enough." I drove home with the weight of it sitting in my chest like a stone I had swallowed whole. The county road wound up through the gray hills past one failed farm, and then another, their barns sagging at the ridgepole, their fields gone over to thistle and cedar scrub. Every one of them a man who had loved this ground and been ground down by it. The valley is beautiful in the way that hard places are beautiful, in the way that takes everything from a man and gives him back almost nothing but the view. And I have loved it every day of my life, and it has never once loved me, and I had made my peace with that long ago. What I had not made my peace with was Sterling Mercer standing in a parking lot telling me my family's 100 years was a write-off and a drainage ditch. Maggie was in the yard when I pulled in. She had been my wife for 31 years, and in 31 years she had learned to read me from 100 feet off, the way a person learns to read weather. She saw the new welding tanks in the truck bed, and she saw my face, and she knew the whole shape of the morning before I had set the brake. "They laughed again," she said. It was not a question, so I did not answer it as one. "They see rocks," I said, climbing down. "I see calcium, I see magnesium, potassium, phosphorus. Everything that field has ever needed, all of it trapped in that slate, all of it locked away where no root in the world can reach it. But if I crush it, Maggie, if I grind it down fine as flour and work it into the topsoil, I will not need one bag of Mercer's fertilizer. I will not need one more dollar of the bank's money. I will break the cycle that broke my father." She did not call me crazy. In 31 years of marriage, she had never once called me crazy, not even the times I had earned it fairly. She looked out across the gray expanse of our land, the same land that had put her own father-in-law in the ground before his time. And then she looked back at me, and she walked past me to the barn and slid the heavy door open on its rusted track. And there, inside, half-built in the dim, stood the skeleton of the thing I'd been welding together in secret through the cold months. It was a frame of salvaged steel, a reinforced mixing drum I had cut off a wrecked concrete truck and dragged home behind the tractor, a hammer mill I had engineered out of a scrap heap, a brutal arrangement of swinging steel hammers that would beat stone into powder the way this valley had spent 100 years beating the carvers into the dirt. Then you had best start the generator, Maggie said. If we are going to be the fools of this whole valley, let us at least be the busiest fools in it. That night I could not sleep, and a man who cannot sleep will sooner or later go looking for the thing that is keeping him awake. I went down to the cellar where the old trunks were stacked, the trunks that had followed the carvers from house to house and generation to generation across 100 years, and I dug down through them, past my father's papers, past the deeds and the death certificates, and the brittle brown photographs of men who all had my same heavy hands and my same set jaw. And at the very bottom of the oldest trunk, wrapped in oilcloth that had gone stiff and dark with age, I found my great-grandfather's notebook. Emmett Carver had died decades before I was born. He was a name on a churchyard stone and a face in 2 old photographs. And nothing more to me, nothing at all, until that night in the cellar. The book itself was a ledger, the kind of thing a man kept his accounts in, but Emmett had not kept accounts in it. He had used it to write down the land. He had used it to write down the dirt. I sat on the cold cellar steps with a flashlight in one hand, and I read my great-grandfather's careful slanting script, the hand of a man who had learned his letters in a one-room schoolhouse and never had cause to write anything but plain truth. He had begun the book in the spring of 1918. He wrote about the weather and about the way the fog came off the low ground of a morning and what it meant when it came one way and what it meant when it came another. He wrote about which stones came up in which fields and what color they were, and how the ground tasted, because Emmett Carver had been a man who would crouch down in his own furrow and put a pinch of soil on his tongue, the way other men tasted wine reading the dirt with his own mouth. And on a page near the middle, in ink that had faded to the brown of old dried blood, he had written a single line that stopped the breath cold in my chest. The answer is locked in the stone. I have seen it once. I will not live to see it twice. I read that line a dozen times sitting there on the steps in the dark. I have seen it once. What in God's name had he seen? What had a man crouching in these same dead fields 100 years before me seen with his own 2 eyes that he had carried to his grave and left behind for a great-grandson he would never live to meet? I turned the page with hands that had begun to tremble, and there, folded small and tucked deep into the gutter of the binding, was a single sheet of paper that had been hidden so long the creases had gone soft as cloth and nearly parted at the folds. I opened it as careful as I could. It was a field record in Emmett's hand dated the autumn of 1918. He had taken a 1/4 acre of the worst ground on the whole place, ground so poor it would not raise a decent stand of thistle, and he had done a thing no neighbor of his could have understood. He had hauled Slate up out of the creek bed by the wagon load, and he had broken it by hand with a sledge through the long iron nights of that winter. Broken it down, first to grit and then to a fine gray powder. And he had worked that powder by the bucket into the dead ground of that 1/4 acre. And the following summer, that 1/4 acre had come up green. Not the pale, sick, struggling green of corn fighting to live, but a deep green so dark it was near to black, the green of a thing that has finally been handed the one meal it has been starving for its whole life. Emmett had written down the yield off that 1/4 acre, and he had written it down twice, as though he could not trust his own figures the first time. And underneath the second figure he had drawn a hard line beneath it, as if to hold it down on the page. And then the entries stopped. 3 pages on, in a hand gone shakier and smaller, my great-grandfather had written that the bank had taken the team of horses for the spring note, that the price of everything had collapsed, that there was no money left for seed and no strength left in his arms to break stone for another winter. The great hard times had come down over that valley like a hammer onto an anvil, and a man who had glimpsed a genuine miracle in the dirt with his own eyes had been forced to turn his back on it and walk away to keep his children fed through the winter. The knowledge had not died with him. It had only gone to sleep. It had folded itself small into a notebook and lain at the bottom of a trunk in the dark for 100 years and 3 generations of Carver men, my grandfather and my father and myself, none of whom had ever once thought to go down into the cellar and look. I sat on those steps until the flashlight dimmed to amber, and something settled into the foundation of me that had not been there when I went down. I was not a desperate man placing a wild bet against impossible odds. I was a man finishing a job that his own great-grandfather had begun 100 years before and been broken off from before he could see it through. The machine standing in my barn was not the invention of a lunatic. It was the very thing Emmett had done by hand with a sledge and a strong back. Only now with steel and a diesel engine and 100 years of waiting pushing it from behind. I went back up the cellar stairs that night, a different man than the one who had gone down them. We began that next week, and the building of the machine became a war fought in 3-week stretches against my own failing body and the empty bottom of my own bank account. I called the thing the Iron Maw, because that is what it was, a great mouth of iron that ate stone and swallowed it down. I fed the slate into it by the bucket load, and the hammer mill screamed, and the whole barn shook on its old sills. And out the bottom poured a fine gray dust that fell soft as flour into the bed of a manure spreader I had modified to lay it down. The first batch took me a whole day to make and covered less than half a row. I cursed the machine, and I rebuilt the screens, and I tried again. For 3 weeks, the nights along the slate belt were broken by the rhythmic, hellish clanking of steel on stone. I lost 20 pounds off a frame that did not have 20 pounds to give. My hands became a map of cuts and burns and split blisters that never had the time to heal before the next one opened over the last. Maggie worked at my side through all of it, her face smudged black with grease and slate dust, her palms gone raw from handling the jagged broken plates. And not once in all those weeks did she tell me to stop. And not once did she ask me whether it would work, because she had decided somewhere along the way that her job was not to ask but to lift the other end of the load. The valley heard the machine. You could hear that grinding for 2 miles on a still night, and at first the talk it stirred was the same mockery I had carried home from the feed store. But mockery has a short life in it when the man it is aimed at refuses to crack, and as the weeks wore on, the talk changed into something a good deal worse than mockery. It changed into concern. They stopped saying that Silas Carver was a fool. They began to say in the low voices men use for such things that Silas Carver had finally broken the way his father Wade had broken before him, the way this hard ground broke every man who made the mistake of loving it too much. One evening, while the maw was running, a car pulled up at the edge of my property and stopped at the fence line, its headlights cutting 2 cones through the hanging cloud of dust. It did not come up the lane. It only sat there at the wire watching, and I knew the car the moment I saw it. I shut the machine down, and the sudden silence rang in my ears like a struck bell, and I walked over to the fence, wiping my hands on a rag that was long past doing any good. Sterling Mercer rolled his window down halfway. He didn't get out. Getting out would have meant putting those polished boots into Carver dirt. "You are violating the township noise ordinance," he said, "and I would not be surprised to find you are violating half a dozen environmental codes besides kicking all that dust up into the air the way you are. The county is going to want to send somebody out to take a hard look at this operation of yours." "It is rock dust," I said. "Ground slate, nothing more. The same stone that has been coming up out of this ground every spring since long before either you or I drew breath. It is not poison, Mercer, and you know it is not. You are not afraid of poison. You are afraid of something else entirely." His eyes narrowed at me in the glow off the dashboard. Afraid of what he said. A broke old man with a glorified blender in his barn. "You have read the same soil studies I have," I said. "You sit on top of this whole valley. You know exactly what happens to dead ground when a man puts the minerals back into it. You just cannot stand the thought of one single farm in this valley turning a crop without paying your cooperative for the privilege first." For a long moment he said nothing at all, and in that nothing I knew I had found the bone under the skin. His knuckles went white on the top of the steering wheel. "You have until the end of the month," he said at last, "to take that machine apart and sign the papers I sent. I have already spoken with the bank." Then he put the window up and drove off, and his taillights went down my dark lane and out onto the county road and over the rise, and I stood there in the slowly settling dust, knowing 2 things with a cold and complete certainty. The first was that it had not been a bluff. The second, and the one that sat the worst, was that the bank, my bank, the one institution on this earth that held the note on everything 4 generations of my family had ever owned or bled for, had been sitting in a closed room talking about me with Sterling Mercer. That second knowledge would not let me alone. It sat wrong in my gut for 3 full days, the way a wrong thing does. A bank does not pick up the telephone and call a man's nearest competitor to discuss the private business of his loan. There is no honest version of that conversation anywhere in the world. So on the 4th day, I drove into town and I sat down across the desk from Edward Holden, the regional manager, a careful gray man of about 52 who carried other people's ruin around in his briefcase the way other men carried their lunch. I did not accuse him of anything. I have learned across a long life that a quiet question will open more doors than a loud one ever will. I only asked him plain and simple who it was that had been inquiring after the status of the Carver note, and Holden, who was a banker to the bone, but was not. I have come to believe a cruel man underneath it looked at me for a long moment across that desk and then dropped his eyes down to the blotter. And that drop of the eyes was answer enough on its own. But he gave me more than the answer. He slid a single sheet of paper across the desk toward me, a printed record of contact, and there on it was the date that Sterling Mercer had first telephoned the bank to ask about my loan. And that date was 3 full days before Mercer ever stood in the feed store lot and offered to buy my land for half of what it was worth. He had set the trap first. He had set it and baited it and made sure it would spring, and only then had he strolled across the gravel to watch me walk into it with my eyes open. I drove home with that sheet of paper folded twice and tucked into my shirt pocket over my heart, and the anger I felt was not a hot thing. It was cold, and it was slow, and it ran down into the foundation of me the way water runs down to find the lowest ground and pools there and waits. Sterling Mercer had not merely stumbled upon a drowning man and offered to help him out of the water for a price. He had been the one with his hand on the back of my head the whole time holding me under. There was a woman living over in the next township by the name of Nora Vaughn. She was an agronomist, a soil scientist, and she had worked 6 years for the Cedar Bluff Cooperative until the spring morning. She stood up at a public county meeting and said in plain words that everyone in the room could hear that Mercer's pesticide and fertilizer protocols were poisoning the watershed that every farm in the valley drank from. They fired her inside of a week. The story of it had traveled every back road and party line in the county the way such stories do. And I had heard it the way I heard most things quietly while loading feed at the co-op counter or waiting my turn at the mill. I didn't know Nora Vaughn then. We had never spoken a word. But I filed her name away in the back of my mind and kept it there. Because a person who has been burned by Sterling Mercer for the crime of telling the truth out loud is a person who might one day come to matter a great deal. The deadline came down on me like a change in the weather. I had not torn the machine apart, and I had not signed his papers, and so on. The last morning of the month, I found myself standing at the edge of the north field with a choice in front of me. And it was the kind of choice that decides once and for all what a man's whole life was ever going to be for. The field lay before me, 20 acres of gray, dead ground, every furrow of it choking on stone. Beside it sat the spreader, loaded heavy and full with the fine gray dust of a winter's broken slate. Behind me stood 3 months of secret welding and 3 weeks of grinding through the nights, and 100 years of waiting folded into a notebook down in my cellar. And on the western horizon, building dark and heavy and climbing the sky, was a wall of cloud, a hard spring storm rolling up the length of the valley from the south. I knew the math of it cold. If I spread the dust now before that rain came, the water would drive the broken minerals down through the dead crust of the soil and into the root zone, where 100 years of starvation might at last be ended. If I waited even one more day, if my nerve failed me at the wire, the storm would pass over and the chance would pass with it, and there would not be another one coming. The note was due. There was no money on this earth for a second try. Maggie came out and stood beside me at the field's edge. She didn't ask me whether I was sure. She had stopped asking me that years before. She only slipped her hand into the crook of my arm and stood there and watched the storm climb the sky alongside me. He told the bank to wait until I fail, I said. He is sitting in his house right now, waiting to buy this whole place for nothing the morning after they take it off of us. Then we had best not fail, she said. I climbed up onto the tractor and started the engine, and it coughed a gout of black smoke into the cold spring air, and then steadied into a long, low roar. For the rest of that gray afternoon, I drove the spreader back and forth and back again across the dead field, laying the fine gray powder down over the gray earth, until the two of them became one single thing, and a man could not have told you where the soil left off and the broken stone began. To anyone driving past on the county road, it would have looked like a fool burying his own wasteland under a fresh load of waste, like the very last act of a man who had given up the ability to tell dirt from gravel. The light failed in the west, and the wind came up out of the south, carrying the smell of ozone and far-off rain. I finished the last pass just as the first fat drops began to spatter the dust at my feet, and I shut the tractor down at the edge of the field, and I didn't go inside. I climbed up onto the porch and sat down in the dark beside Maggie, and the two of us watched the sky open up over the north field. We watched the rain come down in long gray sheets and hammer the powder down into the ground. We watched the runoff go gray at the field's low edge and carry the broken bones of 100 years of stone down into the dark where the roots were waiting on it. I had bet everything I had, the farm, the legacy, my own good name in a valley that had already every one of them decided that I was finished. I had bet the whole of it on a single line of ink in a dead man's notebook, and a thing I had seen one time through the cold lens of reason but had never once seen with my own two living eyes. The rain fell harder. Somewhere across the valley behind a lit window in a house I would never be invited into, Sterling Mercer was no doubt watching this same storm come down and smiling to himself, certain that the weather was doing his work for him, certain it was washing the last of Silas Carver down into the ditch where he belonged. He did not know about the notebook. He did not know that a man had knelt in this same dead dirt in 1918 and watched the impossible come up green out of the worst ground on the place. He did not know that I was not gambling at all. I was keeping a 100-year-old promise. And out there in the wet dark under 3 days of coming rain in the cold ground of the worst field on the worst farm in the Slate belt of Northampton County, something that had been sleeping since before my father was born was beginning very slowly and very quietly to wake. The rain fell for 3 days, and when at last it stopped, the waiting began, and the waiting turned out to be a far worse thing than the storm had ever been. A storm, at least, is honest with a man. It comes, it does its work, it leaves, and you know where you stand with it. But the waiting that came after the long gray purgatory of sodden ground and a calendar nailed to the kitchen wall with a single red mark on it, that is the kind of thing that hollows a man out slowly from the inside without ever once raising its voice. I took to waking before dawn and walking the fence line of the north field in the wet dark, looking for something I could not have named to you if you had asked me, and finding nothing out there but mud and the flat gray sheen of stone dust gone to paste in the bottoms of the furrows. Edward Holden drove out to the farm on the first morning the lane was dry enough to pass. He came in a clean sedan and parked it at the head of the lane and stood on the gravel in his town shoes, and he would not come one step closer than that because the mud would have ruined the leather. And Holden was a man who measured the whole of the world in terms of what a thing was going to cost him. "I have always dealt fair with you, Silas," he said. "So I will give it to you straight the way I would want it. The note comes due the 1st of October. There is no extension written into it this time. I went to the well for you twice already with the board, and they will not let me go down to it a third time." "I understand that," I said. "I do not think that you do," he said, and there was something almost gentle moving under the words. "Mercer has already wired the escrow. The money for the purchase is sitting in an account waiting on nothing but the day the sheriff signs your deed over to him. The very second that note falls into default, this place is his, and there is not one single thing in the law that I can do to slow it down by so much as an hour." He looked past me, then out across the dead gray field with its skin of dried stone dust, and I watched him see what he saw, which was a broken old man who had gone and buried his last chance on earth under a wagon load of crushed rock. He didn't say it. He was too decent for that, or too tired. He only got back into his clean car and backed it carefully down the lane, and left me standing in the yard with the 1st of October hanging in the air in front of my face like a thing I could have reached out and touched. That was the last week of May. By the reckoning of the calendar, I had a little better than 4 months in front of me. By the reckoning of the ground, I had nothing at all, because for the first 2 weeks after that rain, the North Field did exactly what the whole valley had sworn up and down that it would do. It did nothing. Down in the bottoms on the rich black acres that Mercer's cooperative farmed the corn was already up and standing. You could see it from the county road, those long uniform rows of pale green needling up out of the earth-fed fat on the synthetic salts the co-op sold by the pallet load. The whole valley looked at that green, and then it turned and looked at my 20 barren gray acres where not one thing had broken the surface. And the verdict on Silas Carver was written plain across every face before a single word of it was ever spoken aloud. I went into the diner in town one morning for no better reason than that a man cannot sit forever at his own kitchen table watching nothing grow out the window. And when I came through that door, the talk did not stop the way talk stops for an enemy walking in. It stopped the way talk stops at a funeral when the widow comes through the door. The men at the counter looked at me, and then they looked down into their coffee cups and found something fascinating at the bottom of them. And Hank Boone, who farmed the next place over and had known me since we were both boys, throwing chips of slate at fence posts, gave me one small sad nod across the room and then went to studying his eggs as if his life depended on the study. That nod was the worst thing anybody did to me in that whole long spring. Boone was not a cruel man, never had been. He had laughed along with the rest of them at the feed store, the easy, unthinking laugh of a neighbor going along with the crowd. But there was no laughing left in him now. There was only the particular pity a man gives to someone he has watched walk out onto thin spring ice, the pity you feel when you can already hear the cracking startup under his boots, and you know there is nothing left to do in this world but stand on the safe shore and watch him go down through it. I drank my coffee, and I paid my check, and I left, and I did not go back into that diner for a long, long time. Maggie did not waver. I want that set down plain and clear because it would be the easiest thing in the world to tell you that even she lost her faith in those weeks, and it would not be the truth. But there was one night near the end of those 2 barren weeks when I came in from the field after full dark and found her sitting at the kitchen table with the whole stack of unpaid bills spread out flat under the lamp, and she had one hand pressed over her mouth. And when she looked up at me, her eyes were wet and steady and afraid all at once. "Is it supposed to take this long?" she asked me. I did not lie to her. In 31 years of marriage, I had never once managed to learn how to lie to that woman. I do not know, I said. Emmett's quarter acre came up green for him, but he never thought to write down how many days it took to do it. I'm trying to read a book with the one page I need the most torn clean out of it. She nodded at that, and she gathered the bills back into their stack and squared the edges of it with her 2 thumbs, the way she squared the edges of everything, putting one small corner of the world back into order with her hands, because it was the only corner of the world that her hands could reach just then. "Then come up to bed," she said. "That field is not going to grow 1 inch faster with you standing out there in the dark staring at it." But I didn't go up to bed. I went down into the cellar instead, and I sat once more with my great-grandfather's notebook. The way a man goes back to Scripture when the night has gone bad on him. And I read again through the early pages, the pages from before the miracle and before the ruin, the pages where Emmett Carver had done nothing more than write down the plain daily weather. And there in the cramped margin of an entry from the long dry summer of 1919, he had written a thing that I had read a dozen times before and never once in my life understood. When the fog quits the low ground before the sun gets to it, he had written, and the slate sweats wet in the early morning, and is bone dry again by noon, and the rain has gone away to stay a while. Plant deep, or else pray harder. I closed the book, and I sat very still in the dark of that cellar, because for 3 mornings running now, I had walked the fence line of the north field at dawn and watched the fog do exactly precisely that. I'd watched it lift up off the bottoms and burn away to nothing, before the sun had even cleared the eastern ridge, when by every right of the season it ought to have lain thick in the low ground until the middle of the morning. I had watched the broken slate in my own furrows go slick and silver with dew at first light and then go bone dry by 10 o'clock. I had been reading the very signs my great-grandfather had written down 100 years before me, reading them every single morning, and I had not once known that I was reading anything at all. The rain had gone away to stay. A drought was coming on a hard one, and I knew it now in my bones the way Emmett had known it. And every farmer in that valley who had laughed at me was pouring his whole year and his whole livelihood into shallow-rooted corn, raised up on shallow-rooted faith in a sack of chemical salt that would turn to white fire the moment a dry year came down on it. I should have kept my mouth shut. A wiser man, a man with better sense than God gave me, surely would have. But I had spent the whole of my life being the quiet one, the one who saw the thing coming clear as day and let it come on anyway, because no living soul had ever once stopped to listen to him. And I was tired down to the very marrow of my bones of being right too late and too silent for it to matter to anybody. So when the cooperative called its growers' meeting at the Grange Hall that week, I drove in and I sat myself down in the back row, and I waited there with my hat on my knee until Sterling Mercer had finished telling a hall full of frightened farmers that the season was shaping up strong, and then I stood up out of my chair. "The fog is leaving the bottoms before sunup," I said into the quiet. "The slate is drying out by noon every day this week. There is no rain coming, not for a long dry stretch, and that corn standing down in the bottoms has put down roots no deeper than your own hand is long. You ought every one of you to be watering deep right now while the wells are still full, because come August, you are going to be fighting each other for every last drop in this valley." The whole room turned in its chairs to look at me, and for one moment, for one single held breath, I truly believed that some few of them might hear it. Hank Boone half rose up out of his seat near the front, but then Sterling Mercer laughed, and it was a good laugh, a warm and reasonable and patient laugh, the laugh of a clean-coated man correcting a slow child in front of company. "The fog," he said, "the sweating Slate. Gentlemen, the very man who went and buried his own farm under a load of crushed gravel this spring now wants to stand up and read us all the long-range weather forecast out of his grandfather's bones." He spread his hands wide to the room. "We have satellite forecasting in this cooperative. We have soil moisture sensors buried in every field from one end of this valley to the other. And Silas Carver here wants you good men to throw all of that over and go back to planting your crops by the morning fog." The laughter rolled over me, then the same way it had rolled over me 100 times before in that valley, and I sat back down in my chair and I let it roll. There is no profit on this earth in arguing with a man who owns the room he is standing in. I had said the thing that needed saying. I was not going to get to be right out loud in front of my neighbors. I was only going to get to be right. The drought came on in the 3rd week of July. It didn't come unlike ordinary weather. It came down like a judgment handed down from the bench. A high dome of dead still air settled itself over the whole length of the Slate belt and would not move off, and the sky bleached out from blue to a hard, hazy white that hurt to look at, and the temperature climbed up and held and then climbed up again. Day after day after day, the sun came up like the open door of a furnace, and the ground cracked open along the old plow lines. And the creeks dropped to a trickle, and then to a string of green standing pools, and then at last to nothing but dry hot stone. And down in the bottoms, Sterling Mercer's beautiful uniform corn began to die. It died from the root as upward, which is the cruelest way there is for a field of corn to go me. The synthetic salts that had pushed it up so fast and so green in the spring now baked hard in the heat and began to burn the very roots they had been feeding, pulling the water back out of the plants instead of driving it in. The leaves rolled themselves up tight as green cigars and then went from green to a sick gray and then to the dead tan color of old paper. The cooperative's whole way of farming had been built from the ground up on shallow roots and a constant supply of cheap water. And now the water was going and the roots had nowhere left to go down to because that chemical way of farming had never once in 15 years asked a single root to reach for anything. Mercer pumped. He had the political weight in the county to do it, the seat on the water board and the friends in the courthouse, and he threw every switch on every pump the cooperative owned and drew the district reservoirs down to cracked mud, trying to save what could still be saved of his crop. The smaller farms screamed bloody murder about it, and rightly so. There were meetings again, now angry ones, and the warm, reasonable laugh was not much heard around the valley anymore. And here's the thing that he did, the thing that I confess I did not see coming. Even knowing in my bones exactly the kind of man that he was, he cut my water off. I held a small allotment from the irrigation district, a thin lifeline of pipe that fed the high fields in a dry stretch, and it was next to nothing, only a few hours a week. But it was mine by right and by recorded deed going back better than 40 years. And in the very worst week of that whole killing drought, with every farm in the valley already at each other's throats over what little was left in the reservoirs, Sterling Mercer used his seat on that water board to have the entire Carver allotment suspended. Drought emergency, the letter called it. Reallocation of district water to priority agricultural users. He dressed the thing up in the fine, clean language of the public good, the way he dressed up everything he ever did to anybody, but I knew exactly what it was the moment I read it. It was a hand laid flat on the back of my head, pushing me down under the water. The very same hand that had picked up a telephone and called my bank 3 days before he ever offered to buy my land. He believed it would finish me off for good. He believed that a farmer with no water in the middle of a killing drought was already as good as a man in the ground. He did not understand what was lying under my north field. Because while the bottoms burned and cracked and turned to dust, my 20 acres of broken stone did a thing that no living soul in that valley had ever once seen dirt do. It held. The rock dust ground as fine as flour and worked deep down into the soil before 3 solid days of rain had soaked that storm up and locked it down the way a sponge holds water against a closing fist. While the chemical fields all around it split open and gaped at the white sky, my field stayed dark and damp a full 2 feet down, the broken minerals insulating the ground against the furnace overhead, the very same way my great-grandfather's broken slate had done it 100 years before. I didn't need 1 drop of Mercer's district water. I had never once needed it. He had gone and spent his hard-won political capital to shut off a faucet that I had already stopped drinking from. The corn had broken the surface back in the middle of June, pale and slow and altogether unremarkable. Just one more thing in a long spring for the whole valley to pity me over. But now in the worst heat of that whole dead summer, while every other field in the county was burning down to gray paper, my north field did the thing I had read about by lamplight and never once dared to believe all the way down. It turned. It turned a green so deep and so dark that it was very near to black. I was up on the high side of the field mending a fence post when I first saw it, and I want to tell you the truth of that one moment, because a man does not get many such moments handed to him in the course of a whole life. The corn did not come up pale and struggling the way young corn comes. It came up that deep near black green, the very same green my great-grandfather had written down twice in his notebook and underlined because he could not make himself trust his own eyes. The green of a living thing that has finally, after 100 years of going hungry, been set down at last in front of the one meal it was made on this earth to eat. I stood there with the fence pliers hanging forgotten in my hand, and I felt my great-grandfather standing in that field right there beside me. A man dead and buried before ever I was born, the two of us looking together across a full century of waiting at the same impossible green. And I did not trust my own voice enough to say one word out loud. It was that very same week that Nora Vaughn drove up my lane in a station wagon with better than 100,000 miles showing on it and a steel soil core riding upright in the passenger seat where a person ought by rights to have been sitting. I knew her then only by her reputation, the agronomist that Mercer had thrown out for standing up at a county meeting and telling the truth about his pesticides. She had heard the same talk going around the valley that everybody else had heard, that the Carver place had finally up and died for good this time, and she had come out. She told me later plainly meaning to see the corpse of it for herself. She got out of her car at the edge of my black-green field in the white killing light of that afternoon, and her mouth came open a little, and she did not say one single word for a long, long moment. "This is not possible," she said at last. "There is no irrigation running on this field. I pulled the district records before I drove out here. Your allotment has been suspended since July. This corn ought by every law of nature to be dead in the rows. It is not drinking out of a pipe," I told her. "It is drinking out of a storm that fell back in May." She didn't believe me, and I respected her the more for it, because a person who will swallow the impossible too easily is no use at all to anybody. She fetched her corer out of the car, and she walked out into the middle of my field. And she drove that long steel tube down deep into the ground and twisted it and drew up a long, unbroken cylinder of my soil, and when she cracked it open in her two hands, she went absolutely still. "Come here," she said, and her voice had changed entirely. "Come over here and look at this." She had a small field microscope down in her equipment bag, and she shaved a thin sliver of that soil onto a glass slide and bent over the eyepiece. And then she straightened up slow and looked at me with an expression I had not seen on the face of a grown adult in more years than I could count. It was wonder, plain, unguarded, childlike wonder. "It is alive," she said. "Do you have any idea what is happening down in this ground? That rock you crushed up that slate, it is not just lying there in the dirt adding minerals like a bag of lime would. There is fungus growing all through it, threads of it, miles upon miles of it in a single handful of this soil, and it is dissolving the stone. It is digesting the slate, eating it, and turning all that locked-up calcium and magnesium and phosphorus into food that these roots can take up and use right now today, this very minute. And the powder you made because you took the trouble to grind it down so fine gave the rainwater 10,000 places to hide from the sun. That is the whole reason this field is sitting here wet and dark while the entire rest of this county is burning. You did not just feed this soil, Mr. Carver. You went and woke it back up out of 100 years of sleep. I had read every word of that by lamplight at my own kitchen table the winter before. I had believed it the way a man believes a thing he has only read on a printed page, which is to say, not all the way down to the bottom of himself. But to stand and hear a trained scientist say it out loud to my face in the middle of my own black-green corn, in the middle of a drought that was killing every other field for 20 miles in every direction, that was a different kind of knowing altogether. And I felt something deep in my chest let go all at once that had been clenched up hard since the morning Sterling Mercer first offered to buy my land for half. But Nora Vaughn was not finished, and what she said to me next changed the whole shape and weight of the thing. She had taken a second core sample on her way back toward the car, down near the fence line where my ground ran up against the edge of the cooperative's nearest leased acreage, and she ran a sliver of that one under the lens as well, and her face closed up like a door swinging shut. "Mr. Carver," she said slow, I need to tell you something now, and I need you to understand that it is a great deal bigger than your one farm. This soil right here, the co-op's ground, it is dying. And not from the drought. The drought is only pulling back the curtain so a person can finally see it. Those synthetic salts, they have been selling this whole valley for 15 years now. They have been killing the living things in this soil the entire time, sterilizing it down to dead dirt. Every single season, it takes a little more chemical to grow the same corn, because every single season the ground underneath it is a little more dead than the year before. And they have built their entire cooperative on selling the valley, the cure for a sickness that they themselves are causing. What you have done out here, this remineralizing, this is not just one clever trick that happened to save one field in a dry year. This is the thing that could heal every single farm in this whole county. She let that sit into the hot air between us a moment, and then she said the part of it that I had already known in my bones, which means that you are not just one stubborn old farmer that Sterling Mercer happens to want gone. You are the one living thing in this valley that can prove his entire cooperative is a slow poison they have been charging good men to swallow for 15 years. And a man like that does not lose a fight like this one quietly. She was right. She was a great deal more right than either one of us could have known standing out there together in that field. The valley could not stop talking about my corn. All through the rest of that drought, while the bottoms turned to dust, and dead tan paper men began pulling their trucks over onto the gravel shoulder of the county road and standing up in the beds of them just to look out over my fence at the impossible green of it. They saw stalks growing thick around as a strong man's wrist climbing up day after day toward that hard white sky. They saw ears setting on 2 and 3 to the single plant while their own corn died standing in the rows. And when a man took a spade and turned over a shovelful of my soil, it came up dark and crumbling and shot through with earthworms, creatures not one of them had laid eyes on in slate-belt dirt in all their living memory. Hank Boone was the very first of them to come up my lane on foot and stand at the fence and ask me to my face how the thing had been done. He took his cap off his head to ask it, which for a man like Hank Boone is a thing that sits very close to prayer. I told him about the rock dust and the grinding through the winter nights, and the storm I had bet it all on. I didn't tell him about the notebook. Some few things a man keeps for his own. The harder and greener my field grew, the more closely I watched the county road for Sterling Mercer, because Nora Vaughn's warning sat down in me like a swallowed coal that would not cool. A man who has built his whole empire on top of a lie does not stand quietly by and watch the plain truth ripen in a field he can see out of his own office window. And Mercer could see it. His cooperative headquarters sat up on the rise above the bottoms, and that one dark green anomaly burned in his window from sunup to sundown, a living, breathing proof that everything he had sold this valley for 15 years was a poison, and that the cure for it was nothing more than crushed stone and patience, and a thing the carvers had known how to do before ever he was born into the world. So I was not in the end surprised by what he did. I was only surprised, and I am still surprised when I think on it, at how cold a man can go all the way through when his whole life is built on something that has started to crack underneath him. He didn't come himself. He worked it over the telephone, the way he worked everything from behind a desk where the mud could never reach his boots. I learned the full shape of it only afterward, but the heart of it was a simple thing. He called the State Department of Agriculture, and he told them that there was a rogue operation running loose out in the Slate Belt, a desperate, bankrupt farmer dumping some unregulated industrial gray powder all over his fields, that the growth coming off the ground was unnatural and could not be explained, that he strongly suspected illegal chemical dumping that was even now threatening the county water table. He used the word toxic. He used the word quarantine. He took the one thing that had made my field a miracle, the gray dust that had saved it, and he dressed it up in front of the state as a crime. And the cruelest part of all of it, the part that shows you down to the bottom exactly the kind of man that Sterling Mercer was, is that he timed the whole thing for the morning of my harvest. The 1st of October came up clear and cold, the first true break in the heat in better than 2 months, and it was the day the note came due, and it was the day my corn stood ready in the field, and it was the day, if only God and the bank would allow it, that I would pull a harvest off that ground big enough to pay off Edward Holden and break Sterling Mercer and buy my family's good name back from the whole Laughing Valley, all in one stroke. I was up and out before dawn. I fired the old combine, and Maggie climbed up into the cab beside me, and we put the header into that standing wall of black-green corn just as the sun came up over the eastern ridge. The yield monitor on the dash began to climb, and then it began to race, and then it began to read numbers I had never in my life seen on it. And Maggie put her hand flat against the glass of the cab and said my name in a voice I had not heard come out of her in 31 years. "Silas," she said, "is this thing reading right?" It was reading right. We were pulling biological weight off of that field at 10 times anything the Carver place had grown in all its 100 years of records, 10 times what 4 broken generations of my family had ever managed to wring out of that ground. The kernels dense and bright and heavy as shot the hopper behind us, filling so fast that I had to stop the machine and dump it before we had even cleared the first quarter acre of the field. 100 years of waiting was coming up off that ground in a single golden morning, and for about 2 hours of that morning, Maggie and I were the richest fools in all of Northampton County. And then the dust rose up at the head of the lane, and it was not the dust of a neighbor coming to call. A convoy came up my road. State vehicles, white and official with the seal on the doors, and behind them, a sheriff's department truck, and behind that, riding along at the very back, where the watching is best, a clean, dark sedan that I knew the way you know the face of a man who has been holding your head under the water for the better part of a year. They stopped my combine in the row. A man in a department jacket stepped down out of the lead vehicle with a clipboard in his hand and a team coming out behind him in clean white coveralls. And he told me his name was Grady Pierce and that he was placing the entire Carver farm under an emergency state quarantine effective that very instant on a credible report of unregulated chemical dumping and the use of an unapproved soil amendment posing a threat to the regional water table. Not one single kernel of that harvest, he told me, was going to leave the property until the state had tested the soil and the crop and cleared them both, and if they were to find heavy metals or restricted compounds in either one, I would be looking at federal charges. Maggie climbed down out of the cab and came and stood beside me with her chin held up, and out at the back of the convoy, the door of the clean, dark sedan swung open, and Sterling Mercer stepped out onto my gravel at long last, careful even now to keep his boots to the firm, dry ground, and he looked out across the impossible black-green field and at the 3 grain trucks I had already filled to overflowing, and he smiled. It was the first time in all his life that the man had ever set foot on Carver ground. He had waited to do it until the moment he believed it was no longer mine. "Shut it down, Carver," he called across the yard, and he pitched his voice for the inspector to hear it. "This whole valley watched you bury your own farm under poison this spring. The state has just come out to dig it back up." The sun stood full up now over the Slate belt, hard and clear and cold as a coin. Behind me stood 20 acres of the healthiest corn the state of Pennsylvania had ever grown, and it was sealed under a government order on the one single morning in the world that I needed to sell it, and the note came due at the close of business that very day. And the man who had arranged every last piece of my ruin was standing there in my own yard wearing a smile, certain at last and at long last that he had won. He did not know about the notebook lying in my cellar. He did not know about the line my great-grandfather had written down in 1918. The miracle he had glimpsed with his own eyes and been forced by hard times to walk away from. And he did not know, because he had never once in the whole of his clean life knelt down in a field and put the dirt of it to his tongue, that there are records kept in this world far older and far harder to break than anything that a man like him could ever hope to buy. But I knew. And the next 48 hours were going to teach Sterling Mercer the one lesson that the Slate Belt had spent 100 years teaching the Carvers. The ground remembers, and so does the paper that a careful man leaves behind him. The convoy left the way it had come in a slow line of white trucks and yellow dust, and it took my whole harvest away with it in plastic bags and sealed steel evidence cans, and it left behind 3 loaded grain trucks wearing red state seals across their gates like wounds in a silo door padlocked shut by a man I had known for all of 1 hour. When the last engine of it faded out down the county road, the silence that came back into the yard was the loudest thing I have ever stood in. Maggie and I stood in it together. The combine sat dead where I had killed the engine, its header still buried in a standing wall of corn that no man on earth was now allowed to cut. And the October sun went on shining down on 20 acres of the healthiest field in Pennsylvania, the same indifferent way it shines down on a thing that has already been taken away from you. 48 hours, Grady Pierce had said. 48 hours for a state laboratory to decide whether I was a miracle or a criminal. And the note came due at the close of business on that same first day of October. And there was no arithmetic anywhere in the world that could make those 2 clocks agree with one another. I did not sleep that first night. A man cannot sleep with his whole life sealed up under another man's signature. I walked the fence line of the north field in the dark, the same way I had walked it all through that barren spring. Only now the field was not barren. Now it was the richest ground in the entire county, and I could not put a blade to one stalk of it. I reached my hand through the wire once and laid it flat against a stalk as thick as a fence post, and I felt the cold living weight of it, the ears hanging heavy and ready, and I thought about my great-grandfather Emmett walking away from his own quarter-acre in the dead of the winter of 1918, with the bank taking his team of horses and the dollar gone to nothing in his pocket. He had grown the impossible up out of dead stone, and he had been forced to leave it standing in the field behind him. 100 years on, I had grown it a second time, and a man in a clean wool coat had sealed it where it stood. The land, it seemed to me that night, had a very long memory for that one particular kind of cruelty. Edward Holden came out to the farm the next morning, the 2nd of October, and this time he walked up the lane and straight into the mud and ruined his good town shoes doing it, and I knew before ever he opened his mouth that something somewhere had shifted on its foundation. "I have been on the telephone since 5 o'clock this morning," he said. "With the state, with the county, with our own bank council down in the city." He looked tired in a way that had nothing at all to do with the early hour of it. "Silas, I drove out here yesterday meaning to foreclose on you. The board voted the thing through. The papers are sitting in my car right now, and I cannot file them." I waited him out. I have learned across a long life that a man bringing you good news will get to it a great deal faster if you do not crowd him on the way. "Your harvest is under a state seizure order," he said. "Every last kernel of it, and that crop is the only thing of any real value left on this whole place, which Mercer knows better than anybody, which is the entire reason he ever wanted the ground in the first place. But the law does not let me complete a foreclosure sale on an asset that is frozen under an active state investigation. I cannot transfer clear title on a piece of land whose one and only crop might be ruled poison tomorrow afternoon. And here is the thing, Silas. Mercer cannot close his purchase either. His escrow has a contingency written into it. Every escrow ever drawn has one. He cannot buy himself a contaminated farm." He took his hat off then and turned it slowly around in his two hands, and I could see plain that the thing he had driven out here to say to me had cost him something real to come and say it. "He used that quarantine to freeze your harvest so that you could not sell it and pay me off," Holden said. "And the very same freeze now stops me from taking your land and stops him from buying it. He reached out his hand to push you under the water one last time, and he pulled the floor right out from under his own 2 feet doing it. The 1st of October came and went yesterday at 5 o'clock, and nothing happened, Silas, because nothing legal can happen here until the state lifts that seal. Your own worst enemy in this world has gone and bought you the one single thing you needed and could not get. He has bought you time." I stood there in the cold of that October morning, and I felt the whole cruelty of the past 2 days turn over slowly in my hands and become something else entirely. Mercer had built himself a trap so tight and so clever that it had snapped shut on the man who built it. There is a kind of justice in such a thing that runs older and deeper than any justice they hand down in a courthouse. The plain old justice of a man who digs a pit for his neighbor and forgets to count his own steps walking backward. "Why are you telling me all of this?" I asked him. "The board wants my farm." "The board wants its money," Holden said. "I want to be able to lie down at night and sleep. There is a difference between the two. Silas and I have gotten too old to keep on pretending to myself that there is not." He looked out across the sealed field. "And there is one more thing," he said. "When Mercer wired that escrow money in the funds posted through our branch, I have the timestamp on it sitting in my records. He moved that purchase money a full 4 days before the state ever received his complaint against you. He had the price of your whole farm sitting parked and waiting in an account before he ever picked up the phone to call the thing that froze your harvest. And a man does not wire the full price of a farm 4 days ahead of reporting it as a crime scene, Silas, unless he already knows for a certainty how the crime is going to come out." He didn't say one word more about it. He didn't have to. He put his ruined shoes back into his clean car, and he drove away down the lane, and he left me standing there in the yard, understanding all at once that the careful gray banker who had driven out the day before to take everything I had in the world had just handed me a single thread, and that the thread ran straight back to Sterling Mercer's own hand. That same afternoon, Grady Pierce came back to the farm, and this time he came back alone. He was a state man, straight through to the bone, 50 years old, with the flat and careful manner of a person who has spent the whole of his working life being lied to by people who needed something out of him. And he did not waste his words on me. He told me plainly that the testing was underway and that he would not stand there and discuss results that did not yet exist. And then he stood for a long while at the edge of my sealed field with his hands pushed down into his jacket pockets, looking at that black-green wall of corn. And when he finally spoke again, his voice had changed in it. In 22 years with the department, he said, I have shut down a great many operations that looked from the road exactly like this one. Sudden growth, no paper trail behind it, a neighbor making a telephone call. And 9 times out of 10, the neighbor turns out to be right, and there is something buried down in the soil that has no business being there. He turned his head and looked at me square. But in 22 years, I have never once seen corn like that come up out of Slate belt ground. And I have never once seen a field hold its water through the worst drought this state has had in 40 years. And I have read your district file, Mr. Carver. Your irrigation has been shut off since the middle of July. So either you have done the single most reckless thing I have come across in all my years at this job, or you have done a thing that I do not yet have a name for. And I would dearly like to know which one it is before my laboratory has to tell me. I could have kept my silence. Silence had been the whole long habit of my life. But I had learned something hard that summer, that there is a time in a man's life to keep a thing close for his own, and there is a time to lay it down flat on the table where another man can see it, and that a man who has nothing in this world to hide does himself no favors at all by acting as though he does. So I went down into the cellar, and I brought up the oilcloth bundle. And I set my great-grandfather's notebook down on the tailgate of my truck in front of a state inspector, and I opened it to the field record from the autumn of 1918. This is the only thing I ever put on that field besides ground slate and a spring rain, I said. My great-grandfather wrote this down. He took the worst quarter acre on this whole place 100 years ago, and he broke the native stone by hand with a sledge, and he worked the powder of it down into the dead dirt, and the next summer it came up green. And then the hard times came and took his horses, and he had to turn his back on it and walk away. That gray powder your men shoveled into bags yesterday is not industrial waste, Mr. Pierce. It is this farm ground up fine. It has been coming up out of this ground every spring since long before either one of us drew our first breath. Pierce read that page, standing there in the cold with his reading glasses pushed down low on his nose, and he read it through twice, and then he looked up at me with an expression on his face that I could not yet put a name to. May I photograph this, he said. He did a great deal more than photograph it. I learned the rest of it in pieces over the day that followed, and it turned out to be the thing that turned the whole case over on its hinges, and so I want to set it down here plain, because it is the very heart of everything that came after. Grady Pierce was a careful man, and a careful man does not take a farmer's family heirloom as proof of anything under the sun. So he went looking for something to back it up in the one place a state inspector knows by long habit to look, which is the state's own archive. After the Federal Extension Act of 1914 was signed into law, every county across Pennsylvania had been given an agricultural extension office, and men trained at the land-grant college had gone out across the farms, taking soil surveys and writing down in their careful hands everything that they found in the ground. And those records had not been thrown away. They had been boxed and shelved and forgotten in the basement of the agricultural college for the better part of 100 years. And Grady Pierce got on the telephone and had an archivist go down into that basement and pull the slate belt surveys from the years just after the First War. And in a survey dated the autumn of 1919, written out in the careful hand of a long-dead extension agent, there was a note about an anomalous parcel of ground over in Northampton County. A quarter acre of remineralized soil the dead agent had written on the farm of one E. Carver, showing soil fertility and microbial activity wholly inconsistent with the surrounding slate substrate. Cause, undetermined. Recommend further study. There had been no further study. The hard times had come down, and the agent had moved on to other things, and the anomaly of E. Carver's strange green quarter acre had gone down into a box in a basement, and sat there for a century, an official record of the state of Pennsylvania that a carver had grown the impossible up out of dead stone in 1919, and that the trained experts of that day had looked at it and not been able to explain it. My great-grandfather had not just left me a notebook down in the cellar. He had left me a witness that the state of Pennsylvania could not stand up and call a liar, because the witness was the state of Pennsylvania. The 48 hours stretched out into 72 because Pierce held back the laboratory results in order to run the historical match against the archive, and those were the longest 3 days of my life and of Maggie's life with me. The field stood sealed in the yard. The note hung over the whole place by a single thread that Edward Holden had promised me he would not cut, but that his board could vote to cut at any meeting they pleased. The whole valley held its breath. And then on the fourth morning, the town of Slate Hollow gathered itself together at the Grange Hall because the cooperative had called an emergency meeting of its members, and the man who had called it was Sterling Mercer. I will tell you now what that meeting was meant to be. It was meant to be Sterling Mercer's coronation. His own chemical corn had burned down to dead paper in the drought, right along with half the counties, and the board of his own cooperative was frightened now and angry and casting about hard for somebody to lay the blame on. And Mercer meant to stand up at that podium and turn all of their fear into a sale. He had a whole new line of expensive drought-resistant seed corn that he meant to push hard on them for the spring planting, and he had me, the bankrupt lunatic under state quarantine, to hold up in front of the room as the living proof of what happens to a man fool enough to farm by morning fog and his grandfather's bones, instead of by the modern science the co-op sold by the pallet. He believed right up to the end that the quarantine had made me into his very best advertisement. The hall was packed full. Every farmer in the Slate Belt was there because every last one of them was staring down the barrel of a ruined season and a long, hard winter behind it, and fear will fill a room faster than any other thing on earth. Maggie and I came in late and stood together at the very back of the hall by the doors. Nora Vaughn was already there, standing off to one side with a leather folder held flat against her chest. Hank Boone sat down near the front with his cap turning slowly in his hands. Sterling Mercer stood up at the podium in a wool coat that had never once in its life seen a speck of mud, and he had just begun to talk to the frightened room about resilience and about the hard choices that a serious modern operation sometimes has to make when the heavy oak doors at the back of the hall swung open behind us and Grady Pierce walked in. He was not flanked by deputies. He had not come there to arrest me. He came down the center aisle of that hall entirely alone with a thick manila folder tucked up under his arm and his flat, careful face set hard. Like a man who has finally decided a thing, all the way down and behind him came Nora Vaughn with her stack of laboratory printouts, and the whole room went from a low murmur to a silence so complete and so total that you could hear the old iron radiators ticking along the walls. Mercer gripped the edges of the podium with both hands. "Inspector," he said, and his voice was still warm, still reasonable, still the voice of a man who believed he owned every room he ever walked into. "We are in the middle of a member meeting here. If you have business regarding the Carver investigation, it can surely wait until your office." "It cannot," Pierce said, and he didn't stop walking when he reached the podium. He walked right on past it, and he turned his back square on Sterling Mercer, and he faced himself out toward the crowd of farmers in their folding chairs. And that one turning of his back was the first crack to run all the way up the whole edifice, because every single man in that hall saw a state inspector look at Sterling Mercer and decide in front of all of them that Mercer was not the one in the room worth talking to. "For the past 3 days," Pierce said, and his flat voice carried clear and hard up into the rafters of the old hall, "the state laboratory has run continuous testing on the soil and the crop that we seized from the Carver farm out in Northampton County. We tested for heavy metals. We tested for restricted pesticides, for synthetic growth compounds, for industrial contaminants, for every single banned substance that a complaint of this particular kind requires us by law to screen for." He opened the folder in his hands. "We found nothing artificial," he said. "No synthetic fertilizer, no restricted chemical of any kind whatsoever, not 1 part per million of anything that does not occur naturally in the bedrock that lies under this entire valley." The murmur came up through that crowd like a wind moving through standing corn. Sterling Mercer's face had begun to change its color. "That is impossible," he said. "Look at the growth that came off of it. Corn does not come up 10 feet tall in a killing drought on a bed of crushed gravel." He poisoned that field. He poisoned the water table itself to force one last desperate crop up out of the ground before the bank could take it away from him. Pierce turned his head and looked at him. Then finally, and it was the look a man gives a thing he has already finished weighing on the scale. "The yield is unusual," he agreed. "It is the single most robustly healthy harvest I have certified in 22 years with this department. The nutrient density on it is clean off the top of our charts, and it is entirely completely natural." He held up one sheet of paper from the folder. "The gray powder that was reported to my office as industrial waste is ground native slate. We matched it against the bedrock samples ourselves. It is the very same stone that comes up out of every field belonging to every man sitting in this room every single spring. Mr. Carver did not put one foreign thing into that ground. He put the ground back into itself. Nora Vaughn stepped up beside him then, and she didn't give the room a lecture because the room did not need a lecture. The room needed the plain bone of the thing. He pulverized the local slate, she said. He remineralized dead soil, and he woke the living things back up inside of it. While the rest of this valley's chemically dependent ground baked and split open and died in the heat, his one field held the spring stormwater down in it like a sponge. He did not poison this land, he healed it. And every last acre in this county could be healed in exactly the same way. The hall had begun to come apart now at its seams, a low, rising roar of men, all realizing in the same single moment that they have been wrong, and that being wrong had cost them their whole season. But Grady Pierce was not finished. He had saved the part that mattered most of all for the very last, and he raised his flat voice up over the rising noise of the room and brought it back down hard. "There is one more finding," he said, and the room dropped still again on the instant. "When my office receives a complaint about groundwater contamination, we are required by law to test the water table itself, and not only the one field named in the report. So we did. We pulled samples from the aquifer that runs underneath this whole lower valley." He looked out across the crowd of them, and then he let his eyes settle and come to rest on Sterling Mercer. And they stayed there, and they didn't move. "And we did find contamination in this valley's groundwater," he said. "Elevated nitrates, heavy salt loading, the particular kind of slow damage that builds up across many long years from one single steady source." He lifted a second sheet of paper up out of the folder. "It does not come from the Carver farm. The Carver land is the single cleanest ground that we sampled anywhere in the entire watershed. The contamination traces directly and conclusively to the synthetic salt fertilizers that have been applied across this cooperative's leased acreage for the past 15 years. You could have heard a single seed of corn drop on the floorboards of that hall." The accusation had turned itself over in the air and come straight back down on the head of the man who threw it. Sterling Mercer had called the state of Pennsylvania to come and report a poisoned water table, and the state of Pennsylvania had come, and the state of Pennsylvania had found the poison, and the poison had Sterling Mercer's own name written all over it. 15 years of selling this valley the cure for a sickness that he himself was causing in it. And the proof of the whole thing was sitting now in the official record, read out loud and plain, in the Grange Hall to every farmer he had ever overcharged for the privilege of poisoning his own ground. "This is a farce," Mercer said, and his warm, reasonable voice had a crack running through the middle of it now that I had never once heard in it before. "You are all of you taking the word of a disgruntled woman that I fired for cause and a bankrupt old man with a rock crusher in his barn." And that was the moment that Hank Boone stood up out of his chair. He stood up slow, the way a big man stands, and he turned himself around in the second row so that he was facing not the podium at all, but his own neighbors, the men he had farmed alongside the whole of his life, and he held his crushed cap down in one big fist. "I laughed at Silas Carver at the feed store this past spring," Boone said, and his voice came out rough. "I gave him the pity nod at the diner when I had decided in my own heart that he was finished. I have known that man since the two of us were boys together, throwing slate at the fence posts, and I did not stand up for him one single time because it was the easier thing by far to go on laughing along with you, Sterling." He pointed the cap at Mercer. "You sold us all salt and you called it science. You poisoned the water we give to our own children and you charged us by the pallet for the privilege of it. And then when one single man in this valley finally figured out how to grow food without you, you called the state down on his head to bury him and his field both." He looked across the crowded hall at me then, and he gave me a different nod than the one he had given me in the diner. "I want to learn how to build that machine, Silas," he said. "And I do believe that every man sitting in this hall wants to learn it too." "Me too," came a voice from off to the side. "How much for the rock dust?" "Silas," came another one from the back of the hall, and it was half a rough laugh and half something that sat very close to grief. The sound of grown men understanding all at once how many long years they had been paying good money to ruin their own ground. Sterling Mercer stood up there at that podium and felt the whole room turn underneath his feet, the way the soft bottomland turns under a tower built where no tower should ever have been built, and there was nothing left in that hall that he could put his hand to that would hold his weight. The farmers were not looking at him anymore. They had stopped looking at him the very moment Grady Pierce turned his back. And a man like Sterling Mercer is only ever as powerful in this world as the number of eyes that are turned toward him. I learned the rest of it the way a man learns the end of any flood, Slowly, as the brown water draws back down off the land and you walk out and see at last what is still left standing. The state lifted the seal off of my harvest 2 days after that meeting in the hall, the very moment the testing finally cleared and the corn that had been the proof of my crime became overnight the proof of my vindication. Word of what had come up off of that one field traveled out past the valley and out into the wider world, and the buyers who came up my lane after it were not the local mills that had set my price for me my whole life. They were organic distributors out of 3 different states. Men who had been hunting the country for years for grain with that kind of nutrient density in it, and had never once found it, and they stood in my yard and bid against one another for the right to it. I sold that harvest for a premium I had never in my life dared to put a number to. It paid off the $94,000 note to the very last dollar of it. And Edward Holden tore up the foreclosure papers in his own office with his own 2 hands, and he told me that in 30 years of banking, he had never once been so glad to lose a deal. The false report that Mercer had made to the state turned out to be a crime in itself, and the state of Pennsylvania does not take kindly to being picked up and used as a weapon in one man's private war over a piece of dirt. Knowingly filing a false contamination complaint with a state agency is its own offense under the law, and the timing of that escrow wired in a full 4 days ahead of the call, with the timestamp on it sitting quietly in Edward Holden's bank records the whole time, made the one word knowingly very easy indeed to prove against him. And the contamination that Grady Pierce had traced back to the cooperative's own fields did not remain a state matter for very long, because the aquifer that runs under the Slate belt pays no mind at all to a county line drawn on a map, and water that crosses certain lines brings down offices with far bigger seals on their letterhead than Pennsylvania's. By the time the leaves had turned that fall, Sterling Mercer was answering hard questions put to him by people who did not laugh at his jokes and were not the least bit impressed by the cost of his coat. The board of the Cedar Bluff Cooperative voted him out before the first snow fell. A class action came up against the cooperative from the farmers themselves, the very same men who had filled that Grange Hall over 15 years of soil ruined and water fouled and grain prices fixed against them. And the cooperative was remade from the ground up. The new directors did not sell 1 bag of synthetic salt. They taught remineralization instead. And the woman they hired on to run the whole program was Nora Vaughn, brought back to the very cooperative that had thrown her out for telling the truth and handed at last the job of healing every acre she had once been fired for trying to protect. I did not gloat over any of it. I want that understood plain, because the men who watch a story like mine come down. Sometimes want the end of it to be a picture of one man standing in triumph over the body of his enemy. And that was never once the thing that I wanted, and it would not have suited my great-grandfather Emmett either, were he here to see it. Sterling Mercer fell because of the thing that he himself had built, and not because of anything that I ever did to him. I never once raised my voice to that man in the whole of that long year. I only outlasted him the way the slate outlasts every man who ever tried to throw it off his land. And there is a quiet power in that kind of winning that the loud men of this world never do understand until the day it is already sitting on top of them. When the harvest money had cleared and the debt was gone off the place, I went and did one thing that was not strictly speaking sensible, and I have never been sorry for 1 minute of it. There was a parcel of 50 acres that ran along the whole eastern edge of my land. Poor gray slate ground that the Cedar Bluff Cooperative had once wanted for a drainage runoff pond, the very same ground that Sterling Mercer had stood in a parking lot and told me my entire farm was good for, and nothing more. With the cooperative broken apart and the land gone cheap, I bought it. Maggie asked me why on earth I would want 50 more acres of the worst dirt in the county, and I told her the simple truth, which was that it was not the worst dirt in the county anymore. There was no such thing left as worthless ground anywhere on the Slate Belt now. There was only ground that had not yet been woken up out of its sleep. My great-grandfather had known that for a fact in 1918 and been forced by hard times to forget it, and I did not intend to let it be forgotten a second time. I did not patent the machine. There were men who drove out to the farm from the city and told me that I should men who drew me pictures on paper of what a thing like the iron maw might be worth, if only I kept the secret of it locked up tight in my barn. I sent every one of them back down the lane the way they had come. Hank Boone built his own crusher that winter out of scrap and salvage, with me leaning on his fence rail telling him every place I had gone wrong on mine the first time. And by the following spring, there were 3 more of the machines grinding away on 3 more farms in the valley, and the sound of steel eating stone became, for the first time in 100 years, the sound of the slate belt healing itself, instead of the sound of one more man going under. A thing that heals the ground is not a thing that any one man ought to own. It is a thing he is meant to give back to the ground it came up out of. On a cold, clear evening near the end of that year, after the new fields had all been turned under and put to bed for the winter, and the first of the rebuilt cooperative's remineralized acres lay resting quiet alongside my own, I went down into the cellar one last time. I wrapped my great-grandfather's notebook back up in its oilcloth, the same stiff cloth that had kept it safe through 100 years and 3 full generations of carver men who never once thought to climb down the stairs and look at it, and I carried it up out of the dark, and I set it on the shelf in the front room where Maggie and I could both of us see it from our chairs. Not buried at the bottom of a trunk this time. Not folded away into the dark to wait on some great-grandchild to stumble across it by accident on a sleepless night 100 years from now. Out where it could be seen, out where it had finally earned its place. I opened it one last time before I set it down to the page from 1918 to the single line my great-grandfather had set down in ink that had gone brown as old dried blood. The answer is locked in the stone. I have seen it once. I will not live to see it twice. He had been right about every part of it, but the last. He had not lived to see it the second time. But the ground had waited for him the way the ground waits on everything patient, far past the patience of any living man. And it had led a man who carried his same heavy hands and his same name and his same stubborn streak. See, the second time of it for him. I had seen it. I had stood in his field 100 years on and watched the impossible come up green out of dead stone with my own 2 eyes. And that is as close as any man ever gets in this life to keeping a promise that was made before he was ever born into the world. Maggie came and stood beside me at the window, and the 2 of us looked out together at the dark shape of the north field, resting now under the first hard frost of the year. The field that had been the worst ground on the worst farm in the whole valley and was now the richest, and neither one of us said a word for a long while because there was not one thing left that needed saying. My father had died on this land believing it had beaten him, and his father had died believing the same. And the wrong of that sat in me still that evening, and it sits in me yet, and it always will. But the land had not beaten us. It had only been waiting all those long, hard years for one of us to stop fighting the stone and start at last to listen to it. They had laughed at me at the feed store on a Tuesday morning in the spring. They had given me the pity nod across the diner. They had sealed up my harvest and called me a criminal in front of the whole county and stood ready in my own yard to take everything that 4 generations of my family had bled into that ground. And in the end, the thing that saved the Carver place was not a lawyer, and it was not a loan, and it was not a louder voice raised up in a louder room. It was a careful man kneeling down in a field 100 years ago, tasting the dirt of it, writing down in a plain hand what he had seen there, and keeping the paper safe. The ground remembers. I had said that to myself the morning the convoy came up my lane, and I had meant it then as a kind of prayer thrown up against my own fear. I knew now that it was simply the plain truth. The ground remembers, and so does the paper that a careful man leaves behind him, and between the 2 of them together there is no corporation, and no clean wool coat, and no easy laugh in a crowded room that can stand against it for very long. I closed the notebook, and I set it down on the shelf, and I put my arm around my wife. And the 2 of us stood together at the window in the last of the failing light and watched the frost come down silver and slow over 100 years of waiting that had finally, on the cold of that one good evening, come all the way home to rest.
When I was young, I chased the horizon. Certain peace was waiting there. I thought the storms were wrong turns taken, and every burden was unfair. So I spent years fighting the mountains, cursing every winding road, never seeing that the struggle was the thing that made me grow. The eagle learns within the wind, the oak grows strong beneath the snow, and every soul that's worth becoming must walk where harder paths may go. The road was never meant to be easy. The storm was never meant to pass. The waves were not there to stop me. They were there to teach me how to last. Every trial is part of the journey. Every scar becomes a guide. The mountain is not in my way. The mountain is the reason for the climb. I've known loss that left me broken. I've known fear that stole my breath. I've known nights so cold and endless I could barely take one step. Yet every wound became a teacher. Every failure left a mark. And every valley that I walked through placed another star within the dark. The river doesn't fight the canyon. It learns to carve its way ahead. What seems a wall to those who fear it becomes a path for those who tread. The road was never meant to be easy. The storm was never meant to pass. The waves were not there to stop me. They were there to teach me how to last. Every trial is part of the journey. Every scar becomes a guide. The mountain is not in my way. The mountain is the reason for the climb. For the climb. One day I stopped asking, why me? And started asking, what can I learn? The moment I embraced the fire lost its power to burn. For every challenge holds a gift, though hidden from the eye. The obstacle and destination were never separate all this time.